Good morning, everybody. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, digital sports producer from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, back with Paul Zeise, our Post-Gazette sports columnist, for our weekly Zeise is Right video discussion of Pittsburgh sports. Paul, how are you?
I'm doing well, Adam. How are you doing today?
I am hanging in there. Excited for a fun summer of baseball now that I feel like we're finally getting into the football is really over phase of once the draft is done, wrapped up, once you've talked about the draft picks for 2 weeks, this is where you really kind of settle in for the summer, right?
Yeah, actually, in about 2 weeks, because after OTAs happen, and then once OTAs happen, then now there really is no more Steelers content that people can crank out for like 6 to 8 weeks until training camp starts. So I would say once OTAs happen, yes.
Yeah, so we will, of course, have plenty of OTAs content coming up. But in the meantime, Paul, we got to talk about some Steelers free agency news. Hakeem Butler, the XFL receiver, he's washed out of the NFL a couple of times, but he had a great year for St. Louis in the XFL, just wrapped up. I think he had 51 receptions, 599 yards, 8 touchdowns. He's 6'6", 225. Big guy. He has things that that the Steelers receiver room doesn't necessarily have. What do you think of this guy's chances to make the team and maybe make an impact here?
I would say slim. You know what I mean? I don't know that he's probably. Here's the thing: when you're 6'6", 225, and you run at a decent clip, if you haven't hooked on with NFL teams, there's got to be a reason why. I don't know if he's not a good route runner, if he's not physical at the point of attack, or whatever it is. I mean, obviously, there's got to be something, because a guy like that, and really, let's face it, that's one of the reasons why he got a chance, I'm sure, with the Steelers, is they looked at his measurables and said, other guys have flamed out in the past and come back, and they've been able to, redeem themselves, or, maybe they've gotten better over the course of time in leagues like the XFL. And so, it works for them. And all of a sudden now you've got a guy who you basically took no risk on to get, who's 6'6", who's 225, who gives you a red zone receiver, who gives you a presence, in many, many ways. The one thing I will say is that with Darnell Washington, and Pat Freiermuth, you kind of have two guys now that can be pretty good red zone guys for you. That's not to say that this guy, Hakeem, can't do it, but I think it's a very, very long shot that he may. I mean, maybe not make the team, because if you think about it, although we're supposed to believe that Calvin Austin is like the second coming of I don't know, some of these of Antonio Brown, for instance, or one of those kind of guys. I've seen no evidence yet, because we haven't seen him, that he can be that guy. And really, I mean, you've got Pickens, and you've got Allen Robinson, and you've got Deontay Johnson. Beyond that, I mean, who beyond that is a lock to make the team? That's why you would say a guy like this has a shot. At the end of the day, it's not really that deep of a room. I know people don't want to actually acknowledge that, and they got all excited about the Allen Robinson trade, but I said, and I still say, they needed to go draft a receiver and draft one early. I mean, because I just don't feel like their receiver room is all that deep. But to me, you bring a guy like this in, they do it every year. You kick the tires on a guy who's got the athletic talent or the size or whatever it is that, is like, okay, this piece we can't coach. You can't coach somebody to be 6'6", 225 and run. He's got the physical attributes. Now, the big thing is, can he make it all work?
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting. But it's like you said, Paul, I think that's why I like what they've done with the receiver room this offseason, because there is not a ton of risk here, right? If it doesn't work out, then you cut him and you move on. I think the same is true of Allen Robinson, even though you probably have significantly higher expectations for him in this receiver room. But, he's in there, like you said, there's not a ton of depth here. He's in there with guys like Anthony Miller, who I know a lot of people like, Miles Boykin. But maybe he comes in and has a great preseason, right? Isn't that what makes the preseason somewhat interesting if we got to watch these games that don't count?
Yeah, obviously, and I think that's the whole point about training camp. That's why we love training camp, even though we really kind of hate watching preseason games because it feels like everybody's going through the motions. You get to the second half of those preseason games, those guys are all trying to make the team. They're all trying to give you everything they got because they're trying to make the team. That's kind of interesting to me. The tough thing is evaluating this guy if he plays in the second half of preseason games, because he's playing against a lot of guys that probably aren't going to be in the NFL. So, you'll know that they are actually really fully considering him if you start to see him play earlier in training, in preseason games, and even in training camp, getting in there against the twos, and getting in there even, against the ones every so often. They want to see how he plays against real NFL players. And that's the thing. Clearly, he's very, very good against XFL players. Well, there ain't many XFL players in the NFL to compete against. So, he's got to show that he can play at that level. And that's what that's what the process of OTAs and then off-season, workouts, the unofficial workouts they have, where quarterback gets receivers and they go to Florida or whatever and play for a week. And then the training camp, that's what we're going to find out.
Yeah, what do you make of the XFL and the USFL, Paul? Because I'll tell you what, I watch a few Maulers games here and there just because I have this curiosity. I mean, it's a Pittsburgh team, so if I'm not doing anything on a Sunday afternoon, I'll throw the Maulers on and I'll watch them. I'll tell you what, Paul, I think Pitt could win the USFL with an undefeated record. Like, some of these teams are horrific, at least in the USFL. I think some people kind of like the XFL a little bit more. Felt like there was a little higher caliber, but still, compared to what we watch on Saturdays in the fall, these leagues are not very good, I feel.
I think that the big thing is I'm all for capitalism and I'm all for opportunity and I'm all for, but to me, having two of these kind of leagues is silly because now you've diluted the talent in a lot of ways. And so you get what you're talking about, basically, are teams that aren't very good. Football, to me, that's not very interesting. Let's face it, it's not very interesting. And so I feel like it's one of those situations where, you have to understand that it's really important to note that, just because you're good in those leagues, that's not necessarily going to translate to what happens in the NFL. And I've heard weird people who have said things like, well, I think the best XFL team could compete with, I don't know, whoever the worst, like the Lions a couple of years ago. Listen, the worst NFL team would beat the daylights out of whichever league you want to tell me, XFL, AFL, USFL, Arena League, whatever, right? Speaking of which, the Arena League, by the way, as an aside, the Antonio Brown story might be the funniest story I think I've ever heard. But of course, you learn you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. Is basically what I would tell you about Antonio Brown as an owner for the AFL. But my point is, those leagues, the NFL teams would absolutely destroy all of those USFL teams, XFL teams, whatever.
Paul, like I said, I think there are not great college teams that could win these leagues. Honestly, you watch the level of offense that college teams played compared to the basic crap that the Maulers are trotting out there. I mean, no disrespect, like these guys are trying to hang on in football, and individually, like these leagues serve a purpose. But man, I think there's like 7 and 5 ACC teams that could win this league, Paul. If we're being honest.
Well, here's the thing. I generally say, every pro team would beat every college team, but I'm talking about pro teams at the highest level. So I would have to take a look at the rosters of, say, like the USFL team or the XFL team, and really kind of come to a conclusion one way or the other. But I would tend to believe that, for instance, a team like Alabama probably is big enough and physical enough, or at Georgia, right, that they could probably withstand whatever disadvantages they might have along the line. And clearly they'd have big advantages at the skill positions. So I don't know that you're completely out in left field when you say that, from the standpoint of that. But the argument that always drives me nuts well, I think Alabama would beat the Jets, or those kind of things. And it's even worse in basketball. There are some people that really believe like Duke or whatever would beat the worst NBA team. And it's like, do you actually watch the NBA? Because if you did, you wouldn't think that for a single minute. But the disparity in talent. Now you're talking about the USFL and XFL, the disparity in talent. The difference is, for instance, Pitt last year, right?
Pitt had guys who are going to play in the NFL.
That's what I mean. That's what I'm saying. That's what exactly like if Alabama or if Georgia played the Jets, they're playing against the roster of 52 NFL guys.
Right.
So the fact that they both of those teams have like say 30 NFL guys, spread out over 4 classes or whatever, or 20 or 25 or whatever, Pitt has probably on their roster last year, probably 15 guys that'll play in the NFL, 12, to 15 spread out over 4 or 5 classes. So that's probably 12 to 15 more than an XFL team or a USFL team has. So I actually don't think you're that far off with that.
Yeah, I mean, just the quality of the offense just is mind-boggling. But, Paul, we got a couple other moves to talk about for the Steelers. If you've stuck around through our XFL conversation, Ahkello Witherspoon has been cut. He's leaving. It's not as if the cupboard's bare anymore, Paul. There's Patrick Peterson, there's Joey Porter Jr., you still got Levi Wallace, and then this Corey Trice guy that they brought in the 7th round. A lot of people think pretty highly of him. Was this just kind of a natural divorce given the depth that they've built at that position, over the past, few months?
And Mollett too, right?
Yes. I believe he left last week.
So, it tells you that, yes. I think what now, they did so much to bring guys in at so many positions. Now they've got to make these kinds of decisions. And the bottom line is Witherspoon to me was always a short-term fix. He was always a guy that was basically going to be a plug-and-play guy that you plug and play until you find a better player, and that's who he is. Reasonably good. I would say second or depth corner, not much more. And those guys, you know what? The rookies they brought in and some of the guys they brought in, they probably looked at them and said they can do the job just as well and they're a lot cheaper. I mean, that's really how the business is. It's a brutal business that way. I'm sure another team will pick up Witherspoon because he's a guy that, he's an NFL corner who has proven he can play at a reasonable level in that league at that position. And teams are starving for players at that position. But clearly the Steelers have really built their depth there. And they've built that position to the point where, they were able to lose a few guys like that.
I believe Mason Rudolph's return is still pending, too. I don't believe as of the time we're recording this, it's official, but it looks like we're heading in that direction, Paul. Lots of conversation in Ray Fittipaldi's chat about that. People wondering, is Mitch Trubisky in trouble for the number 2 job? Can you believe that Mason Rudolph took this indignity of being downgraded to the number 3 quarterback last year? Paul, there's a weird fascination from my perspective with this guy. No one wanted him anywhere near the starting job Hodges when it was 2019. And then as soon as Mitch Trubisky comes in, now Mason Rudolph is the most popular guy in town who's been wronged in any number of ways. To me, he's a good number 3 that if you lose your first 2 guys, he can still go in, give you a chance to win a game, a game or 2. He's not going to be your guy for the long run. If he is, you have problems. I mean, that's a number 3 quarterback, isn't it?
Well, that's what, all the goofy, screaming and yelling about Mason Rudolph makes no sense to me at all. If he signs, which it sounds like he's going to, he's the 3rd string guy. And, like the guy, you obviously I work at the Fan as well. The guys that are on in the afternoon spent 4 hours yesterday shrieking about Mason Rudolph. And I'm like, he's the 3rd string quarterback. And here's the other thing I'd say to you, Adam, to all the people that are angry about it, right? Go around the league, 32 teams, and tell me where he ranks among the 3rd string quarterbacks. And then get back to me.
I'm sure San Francisco would love to have him at the end last season, right?
Absolutely. As opposed to what they had to try and do with, was it Josh Jackson or Josh Jacobson or whatever the hell his name was, Josh Harris, whoever the hell it was that they had to put in that playoff game. Absolutely. And that's my point. My point is Mason Rudolph to me is for no reason. Here's two things that he's done wrong. Okay. Number one, he was drafted and was like a, perceived or real threat to Ben Roethlisberger's legacy. And so Ben was a total douchebag to him and basically treated him like a crap. And basically all of Ben's fanboys, sort of got behind Ben, and Mason became the bad guy, right? And then, of course, he had that season where he lost the game, and he lost his job to the Duck because he was hurt, basically. Nobody wants to talk about that, but he wasn't healthy when he lost his job to the Duck, but that's okay. And then he lost, and then he tied the Lions, which again, because there's no room for nuance and critical thinking and actual discussion, it's easy. Well, he couldn't even beat the Lions. Okay, well, he didn't practice that entire week as the quarterback. He wasn't the number one guy the entire week. That Saturday night, even after the walkthrough, was when he found out he was going to play. And he had to play in horrific conditions for a quarterback. And that's not saying that, hey, you should beat the Lions. But let's not make it seem like that was actually a fair evaluation of his ability to play quarterback.
Well, people forget too, Paul. The Lions won some games from that point forward. You know what I mean? Like they were not this historically terrible team.
But yes, but regardless of that, they my point is, there were actually reasons why it's hard to evaluate exactly what Mason Rudolph did in that game. But we don't want to do that because again, people have their minds made up, and he's so polarizing. The thing is, he's your third string quarterback. He's always seemingly been a good guy who said the right things. He seems to be a good guy in the locker room, right? He'll hold a clipboard and never play. Why does anybody care one way or the other than to say the Steelers got a really good, and I mean a really good, third string emergency quarterback, given the fact that most of those third string emergency quarterbacks are terrible.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing too: is that there's a weird people have this weird equivocation of Mitch Trubisky and Mason Rudolph. Mitch Trubisky has won games in the NFL. He's won games for the Steelers at this point, Paul. I'm not saying he's any greatest of all time type of guy, but I think he's clearly better than Mason Rudolph, and pretty much every assessment the Steelers have made for 3 years reflects that, right?
Yeah, I think what people are thinking though is if Mason Rudolph has a good training camp, the Steelers could save money by cutting or trading Mitch Trubisky. They wouldn't cut him, but trading him. I don't think that's why you make a move like this. I think you let Mason Rudolph go out. He probably found the market was a lot softer for him than he thought it would be. And then you offer him a contract and say, listen, come back. Who knows what's going to happen? And he comes back, and now you've got depth at the most important position on the field. You now have depth, real depth. And so, and let's face it too. Kenny Pickett's had how many concussions already in his career? He got banged up a little bit last year, right? So the bottom line is you could maybe go through a stretch next year where you have Mitch Trubisky have to start 4, 5, 6 games. Well, if he gets hurt, what happens? So, I mean, you've got to think of those things. If you can get somebody like Mason Rudolph, and I'm sure when they get him, it's going to be at a very, very cheap price, you make your team better because now you are in really good position at quarterback in case something happens. Yeah,
I think that's just you want to give yourself outs, especially at this stage where it doesn't really matter, Paul. I mean, we can talk about when we get down to the number crunching time at the end of training camp in September, but it's May. So everyone just relax. I want to switch topics to the Pirates, the ongoing saga with Endy Rodriguez, Henry Davis. They continue to tear up the minor leagues while the Pirates trot Austin Hedges and his .130 batting average out there, Paul. We've talked about this on the show before. Do you have any new thoughts on the topic of? I mean, this is just blatant service time manipulation.
Well, yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I'll tell you this: in about the next time we do this recording, right? I would be willing to bet the next time we do this recording, nobody will be talking about, Buccos on pace guy. On pace guy won't be talking about what the Buccos are on pace for, because they'll probably be, a game under 500 or something, because, as I said, when they were, 20-8 and everybody was losing their minds, 162 games does not lie. You are who you are. In a grind of a baseball season, you can't run and hide. You can't trick things up. The first couple of weeks, they were able to run on everybody because people were still trying to figure out the clock rolls and all that other stuff. You notice how that hasn't really happened the last 3 weeks, right? I mean, we haven't seen. In fact, they started getting thrown out, and all of a sudden now, we're back to the point where, there were some people talking about how, oh yeah, now these new roles. I really believe that, Ricky Henderson's 130 stolen bases in a season, and that someone could actually break that now. I'm telling you, it's never going to happen. They're never, ever going to get back to the way it was in the 80s and, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when teams were able to run like that. But my point is, you are who you are. And, I said it on this show when they were 20-8. What did I say? I picked them to be a 75, 76 win team. I still think that's what they're going to be. And of course, I had all kinds of people on Twitter, the on pace guy, telling me they'd have to go 50 and 150 or something to finish with. Listen, I don't get that moved. And this is why I'm not good at doing baseball, Adam, because I don't get that moved one way or the other over small sample sizes. I never have, right? I don't get giddy when a team wins 5 or 6. And one of the things that drives me more crazy than anything is when I sit there and I look at the Jumbotron and the guy gets up and it's like, he is 6 of his last 18 or something. You know what I mean? Okay, good. Now, to your question, and this is where I'm going with all of that. This is to your question. There's enough evidence of Austin Hedges, not just from this season, but the volume of at-bats he's had in his career, that suggests he can't hit. Period. So if you're going to run him out for 162 games, right? And I'm sure, he won't play 162, but if you're going to keep him out and you're going to keep running him out there, 4 out of 5 nights, whatever they're doing, I'm surprised some analytics guy hasn't gotten together and said, okay, you basically are putting, if he gets 4 at-bats, you're putting 3 guaranteed outs in the lineup every single night, and some nights 4. And that, over the long haul, takes its toll. There is no reason in the world why a team that is really struggling to score runs at least play the other guy who can hit a little bit. I'm tired. The service time manipulation stuff, we've already talked about that. But I'm tired of the whole thing about, he's good with his glove. And he's good with pitch framing. And he's good at scouting other pitchers and scouting other hitters and putting together game plans. If he can't hit on a team that can't score and can't hit, then he's part of the problem.
Paul, that stuff, I completely agree with. That stuff is relevant when you're talking about a guy who can hit like Russell Martin or a guy who can hit like Francisco Cervelli, guys that have not just pop, but the ability to get on base, are good hitters. Maybe they're not going to be like Johnny Bench or anything, but
right,
but that's why they had the defensive component, they had the offensive component as well, and they were undervalued because at that point in time in baseball analytics, you weren't talking about pitch framing basically at all, and those guys were really good at it. The Pirates recognized that on the front end, and they got a lot of value out of those guys because A, they could hit, and right, B, their defensive value was underrated. In this case, the guy can't hit. And we're 10, 15 years into the pitch framing world now, right? There's no secret about what that is worth. And so it's not like the Pirates are getting a ton of value out of that if the guy can't hit at all.
That, and I'll tell you the other thing is, I feel like if he were to just hit like 235, 240 with a little bit of power, you could live with it if he's really as good defensively as they say. The guy can't even hit 150.
If he could hit 200, Paul, 200, like 200 with a little bit of pop like Max Muncy has would be great.
Right, but that's my point here, and I think when the Pirates, I didn't want to get into the service time discussion, but here's my thing: the Pirates are telling you right now they don't believe that they're a contender. That's what they're telling you. They're telling you that it's more important for them to protect quote unquote service time of these two young catchers and, some of the other players that they have down there that probably should be up, that are better than some of the guys that are up. They're telling you that basically they're going to kick the can down the road because that's more important, because they really believe next year, the year after, it's really going to happen. But my point is, how many more times can we do that? How many more times can you kick the can down the road and claim, well, we're not necessarily contenders this year, but next year we'll be contenders?
Because it's going to be the same thing next year, Paul. I mean, there's going to be guys that are going to be down there that you're going to be talking about. Are they going to come up? Are they going to come help? And here's my thing. The thing that, like, they really just insult your intelligence, and I've about hit the roof with it. Many people on Twitter have too, many smart Pirates fans. Ben Cherington goes out there on his little Sunday discussion and says, "Oh, well, we need these guys to get more reps behind the plate." And then he trots Henry Davis out there in right field, where he has him DH, and he's almost played in the field more than he's caught. And so that's the reason you're keeping him down, but then you're not letting him catch.
Well,
that's just telling us that they think that we're stupid, Paul. And that's where I really get insulted, is that it's one thing if you want to say, yeah, we're going to manipulate the service time. When you come up with such terrible excuses for manipulating the service time and you insult my intelligence, that makes me more angry than if you had just said, yep, it's Super 2, we're playing the game.
Absolutely. And that was, I'm glad you brought that up. Don't tell us you're trying to get them more at bat or more reps catching, and that they haven't caught enough games and all that other stuff, and then you put them in right field and whatnot. I mean, to me, listen, I wish that this regime was more honest in the things that they say. Now, I will give them credit for one thing over the last regime, and that is they just don't say anything. And when they do, they get indignant when they get asked questions that they don't want to answer. The last regime, said a lot of words that actually never said anything, right? But they said a lot of words, and so, it was people were able to get a lot of quotes out of them. This regime doesn't like to answer questions. They don't like to be questioned. But when they do, it's always some condescending nonsense that it's like, well, you guys don't know what you're talking about or what we're trying to do here. So let me explain it to you. And then when you explain it to you and say, well, but that doesn't even add up and make sense, then they want to get indignant with you. So to me, it's a cycle that's ridiculous.
Yeah. I've had it with that. And that's just tell me that that's the way you want to play the game. I'm much more okay with that than you insulting my intelligence and acting like I can't pull up the Indianapolis lineup. I can't pull up the Altoona lineup in 2 clicks from like the screen that I'm on with you now. I can, and I know what's going to happen tonight in Altoona. It's not 1963. It's not like some big mystery what's happening in these places. So with that, Paul, I want to transition into some college football realignment talk. There's been a lot of news out of the ACC meetings this week. You wrote a column about it, which I'll include the link to down in the description, that basically there's ACC teams that want to either leave the ACC or get more money out of their conference peers because they believe that's what they need to compete. Florida State, I believe their athletic director was the most outspoken, saying there's a $30 million gap between them and the SEC and Big Ten teams under these new television contracts, and he can't stay locked in until 2036 with the ACC's current media rights dealer. The $30 million every year is going to compound, and Florida State will never be able to compete. Paul, I'm just going to let you summarize your column. What do you think of all this conversation?
I think the ACC, as I said in my column, I think some of these schools are delusional, absolutely delusional. I mean, Florida State at least is a national name brand, and I'm sure that the SEC or somebody would take them, right? Clemson, probably the same thing. Virginia Tech, even North Carolina, right, as a football brand. What are we talking about here? But here's the most important part of it, Adam. All of these schools when the last round of realignment happened, they all panicked, got into a room together and said, we've got to stick together if we're going to survive. So let's commit to this grant of rights deal, right? Which is the worst deal anybody in college athletics has ever signed, because it completely takes away all of their flexibility, all of their leverage, all of their ability to go somewhere else or do something else, which is why now they're all, well, we're getting our lawyers to look into this and that and the other thing. And I think Florida State even, they even floated out the idea if 25 through 36 is 11 years, right? Well, if we stay here, it's going to cost us $330 million. So maybe we should just pay the 150 or whatever it is and get out of it. I mean, at the end of the day, they all panicked and they all said, we've got to stick in this together. So now, when the other conferences are all doing their new deals and they're all getting much more money and they've realigned and they've shifted and they've done this, now all of a sudden the ACC is stuck. And you know what I always say? You did it to yourself. You did it to yourself because all of you couldn't trust each other. You couldn't trust each other because if you didn't do that grant of rights, if you're Boston College, you love the grant of rights, right?
If you're Pitt,
you love it. If you're Boston College, if you're Syracuse, you love the grant of rights, right? If you're Virginia, you should love the grant of rights, because the bottom line is it keeps Florida State and Clemson in your conference. But Florida State and Clemson were so short-sighted and stupid for signing that and agreeing to that. Now they're stuck with it. But to me, and Adam, this comes down to the fundamental question I have. When is enough enough? How much is enough? Like, there's this arms race. It's one thing, and you know me, I'm a capitalist, free market guy. But this is college athletics we're talking about. And yes, there's a business part of it, and it's big time and this and that other thing. But if you have an arms race, right, where it requires you to get $80 million from your media rights deal to be able to operate and compete, we're probably doing things the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean that's why I think college sports needs a commissioner, Paul, because we shouldn't be having this tug of war and power struggle between these conferences, where you're messing with fan bases, right? Because if you're a Pitt fan, and that's probably who's watching this, right, or a Penn State fan, but Pitt's the relevant thing to the ACC conversation is, what are they going to do if you're looking at the future and it looks like Clemson and Florida State don't want to be here anymore? Are you just going to keep them there because you can, or because eventually that rent's going to come due too, Paul? Like if you're Pitt and then Clemson and Florida State bolt, and then what happens to you? And then what does that do to fandom in college football? If you're a Pitt fan and you're wondering, are we going to be on the top level of college football? How invested are you going to get? And isn't it going to thin out the lower ranks here in terms of interest to the point that you just end up with these big power programs dominating everything, and you have kind of a like small NFL, an NFL minor on Saturday?
No, absolutely. That's the problem. You've chopped up your fan base enough. To me, the 12-team playoff will help, but I also think it'll hurt. It'll help because I think, more teams will have access to the playoffs. It'll hurt because I think those first round games and even some of the second round games are going to be just ridiculous because the disparity between, say Georgia, at number 1 playing against number 16, who, is almost always going to be the group of 5, champion or whatever. I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at it, I think the playoff games are not going to give people what they want. They're not going to be like NFL playoff games that are all usually very exciting and very competitive. So it's a catch-22. So the way that you get around that is if you basically just have 4 16 teams or 4 16 or 4 20 team conferences, or 4 16 or 4 20 team conferences, and you basically make major college football where all 4 of those conferences have the same deals, have the same amount of money, have all of that stuff. And then all of a sudden you get closer to what you have in the NFL. Until something like that happens, they just keep finding ways to ruin it a little bit. And, if Clemson and Florida State left the ACC, then you would basically have three conferences, the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the ACC, that are just sort of tattered and dangling in the wind, waiting to be picked off. That's not a good system. That's not a good plan.
Yeah. It's like you're saying that there's, I don't know, half of the schools in the Power Five at this point are just kind of chum. And then if you're one of the fans, like maybe no one of those teams has a ton of fans, Paul, but if you add up all of those fan bases and you say, well, we're going to relegate you to what like the AAC is now or Conference USA. We're going to relegate you to this subdivision where, you're in Division I, you can theoretically beat these teams, but you're not competing on an equal level, then you're narrowing it to like maybe you have 30 teams that people care about. And I just think that that's bad for the sport, because the cool thing, the reason college football is so popular is because on any given Saturday, there's hundreds of stadiums around the country that people are sitting in. That's why they outdraw the NFL. Does that continue if you say, we're really just going to condense this down to 30 or 40 programs, and that's going to be college football?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's good. I don't think it's a good plan. I do think that it wouldn't be terrible if you basically had 80 power teams in 4 20-team conferences, and they are all access to the same amount of money and the same resources and all that. It would make it more competitive, and that might be exciting. The problem is, what do you do with teams 81 through 120? Do you relegate them to FCS? Right? Do you know what I mean? It's a difficult process.
Yeah, and there's no good answers. I think the thing that's encouraging for Pitt fans is that they have talked a little bit about finding revenue for these higher value teams that win more. Maybe they can win their way into making a little bit more money, and maybe that'll calm the waters for the time being. But yeah, Paul, I also wanted to ask you about the Penn State whiteout situation, because people are getting fired up because now speaking of television contracts and the way they're changing college football, this big noon Saturday that Fox has is the package. They get to pick the best Big Ten game every week if they want it and stick it at noon. And so Penn State's games against Michigan and Ohio State that have traditionally happened in prime time, under the lights, in the whiteout, with that great scene in Happy Valley, those games are now probably going to be played at noon unless either Penn State stinks, Ohio State stinks, Michigan stinks. Those games are going to be played at noon. And now you have this question of, well, when do you play the whiteout? Do you play it against a lesser opponent on, another Saturday night, or do you reserve it for Michigan and Ohio State? So far, they've chosen to go the route of playing a lesser team. They did Minnesota last year instead of Ohio State at home. And this year, they're going to do the whiteout for Iowa, which, granted, has been a thorn in their side for a long time, instead of Michigan at home. Paul, what do you think of that whole debate?
I have a solution. They should play home and home every year with Pitt and West Virginia, which means every year either Pitt or West Virginia comes to Beaver Stadium. There's your whiteout game every single year. Everyone's happy. How about that? Okay.
I mean, I would be into that, Paul, but I know there's a lot of people in Happy Valley that say, those programs don't deserve to be the whiteout victim.
Well, again, I mean, that's the whiteout to me. Can't you do it during the day? Why not just do it during the day? Everyone wear white and have exciting. You know what I mean?
People say it doesn't pop as well.
What I found about college football and pro football is if you play it at night, it's a different atmosphere anyway. You know what I mean? Whiteout or not, it's a different atmosphere. So I guess, if you want to do the whiteout thing, and you want to make sure that it's at night, you probably should find your best Big Ten game that doesn't involve Michigan and Ohio State every year. Because that's what it's going to be, And Iowa actually is a really good game. And it's actually an important game. And it's a big game, and it probably will be a competitive game. So what's wrong with doing the whiteout then? I don't get it. Yeah,
I don't have a problem with Iowa, Paul. Like, sorry, if you're a Penn State fan, you can't get up for giving Iowa 3 hours of hell in the whiteout, given what they've done to Penn State over the years. Then I don't know what team you've been watching this whole time, right? You think 2008 they stole their chance to possibly make it to the national championship game. A few years ago, they ruined their undefeated record and sent them spiraling. I think, what was that, 2021? That matchup where they were both in the top 5 and Iowa won and Penn State just kind of careened out of control from there. If you're a Penn State fan, shouldn't you want to beat the crap out of this team?
Absolutely. Iowa's been a thorn in their side. And also, Iowa's a team that plays the style of football that the Penn State games always seem to be terrible. So at least if you have a whiteout and there's excitement and atmosphere in the crowd, it will make it so those of us watching will ignore the actual football going on the field, because those games are usually terrible in terms of the aesthetic value of them, but they're always close.
Yeah, so I think it'll be an interesting, fun game to watch. I think it'll be one of the first night games on CBS in Happy Valley. So I'm looking forward to that one, Paul. I'm starting to the drum line starting to rattle in my head a little bit, Paul. I'm starting to get excited for the college football.
Yeah, well, we got about another 2 or 3 months before training camp starts even. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of topics to talk about when it comes to college football over the next few months.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, thanks for stopping by this week. I think we had some good discussion, and thank you all for watching. And we'll be back later in the week. We'll have Christopher Carter with the North Shore Drive. I think he'll have Brian Bacco on, plenty more Steelers talk. So make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you like the video. Help us out with the YouTube algorithm. And we'll talk to you all again soon. Thanks, Paul.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.